It's been entirely too long since my last update video. Looking at the YouTube channel, it's been almost a year, and frankly, that's a little embarrassing. I have been providing sporadic updates via social media during that time, but I think I owe everyone a real update video. I'm not going to get too organized or formal about this, and I'm really just shooting from the hip, but better to get something out than nothing at all. So, what have I been up to for the past year? Well, I've actually been working on all the same projects you already know about, and steadily making progress, but there have been a lot of small issues that wind up becoming rabbit holes that have been distracting me and keeping me busy. Plus, just all the usual life stuff that comes up in the middle. So, the first project that I'm going to talk about is the one that I think most of you have been interested in for the longest time, and that is the Printalizer Enlarging Timer and Exposure Meter. So, I've been simultaneously and somewhat overlapping working through a whole number of things with this project, and let's just go through them. So, the last time we spoke, I had a prototype that was working that looked something like this. So, with this prototype, I had been using an enclosure vendor that I had been using ever since resuming the project that, unfortunately, due to a number of issues, I found myself having to move away from. And that wound up being quite a big project in and of itself. You see, it was one of those enclosure vendors where you have to design everything, or at least it's suggested to design everything with this particular software that they provide to make sure that they can manufacture everything. But it also kind of locks you in. So in order to switch vendors, I basically had to take the entire design of this enclosure and redo it as a sheet metal project in a more traditional CAD package. It didn't really change anything about what it looks like, but it was a bit of work to redo. But once I did that, I had portable design files that I could take anywhere. So the next thing that I did was I shopped around and I found that a different company that I had previous relationship with also did sheet metal manufacturing. So I reached out to them and used them for the next prototype. And I was actually very pleased with the quality of the result, except a few months later, when I was ready for yet another prototype, I discovered that they woke up one morning and decided to stop doing sheet metal work. So, for the current prototype, I had to switch to yet another vendor. And every time I switch, it's, a good month plus of lead time to get the next design through. And then every time you do, there's always minor issues that have to be worked out. So, I think I'm now in a pretty good place with a design that works pretty well. And I think I've gotten most of the kinks worked out of it, and it'll hopefully be smooth sailing from here on out, but we'll see. Still, it's kind of ridiculous how I've had to go through so many iterations on just the enclosure. Another thing that I've sort of worked on during this time, a bit in the background, is various aspects of the display on the device. So, the display that I'm using right now is a 256 by 64 pixel yellow OLED display that I put a red filter on top of. And I've always wanted something a little bigger. Both because, well, it's always nice to have a bigger display, and because I would love to have more pixels. So, I've been trying pretty much everything that I could come across. And I'll definitely splice in some pictures of some of my experiments. One thing I started with was I found a red LCD display that would have the advantage of not even needing a filter, and thus it would be very bright and visible in a darkroom. Unfortunately, being a traditional LCD, it has a terrible viewing angle. And for a device that's intended to be looked at from an angle sitting next to an enlarger, this was a showstopper. Then I found this large, really nice looking white OLED display that was extremely tempting, except it had a few problems. First, it was very expensive, though I did find some slightly cheaper sources. Second, it had some power issues and refresh issues that I could probably resolve well enough with some work, but they made it difficult to photograph, such as the two halves of the display refreshed a bit unsynchronized from each other, which you don't notice in person, but you really see it on camera. And third, perhaps most important, because it was white, it was actually very difficult to make this thing darkroom safe. It could pretty much burn straight through any filter I stuck on top of it. And so in order to make it darkroom safe, I'd have to make it very dim, because the problem is it emitted a lot of light outside of the desired paper-safe spectrum. A yellow display only emits a little light outside the spectrum, so the filter doesn't have to do as much heavy lifting. And finally, very recently, I actually found an OLED display that's similar in size and resolution to that red LCD that I sort of started this adventure with. Picture quality isn't quite as good as the display I've been using all along, and it's a newer product and it's a little bit harder to source, and so I'm thinking I'm probably still just going to stick with the display that I was using a year ago. But again, it takes a lot of time to try all these things out. Another thing that I spent quite a bit of time with is another round of paper safety testing. I needed to decide exactly which filter material I was going to use, and I also realized that I need to test both Ilford and FOMA paper. And I found that the filter that I was using wasn't quite up to the task with FOMA. I also discovered that some of the red LEDs that I had embedded in the corner of these buttons right here also weren't quite up to the task with FOMA. So since I wasn't really doing that much with them, I decided to switch these out for buttons that didn't have LEDs. But I think I figured out filter material that gets the job done that I'm going to be going forward with. But still, you know, that was a lot of testing. Then, among all of this, was the whole issue of the meter probe. So I did the most dangerous thing you could do and spent a lot of time chatting with someone in a certain photography forum with lots of opinions that aren't necessarily bad, but they can definitely lead you down rabbit holes. So the meter probe that I was using up to when we last spoke looked something like this. It was about this big, though I've also been iterating on the design of the meter probe itself. And on the other end, it used a mini DIN connector. This is similar to what an old PS2 mouse or keyboard would use. I figured I could buy these cables, slice them in half, and attach them. Well, this cable has a couple of little problems. So the one that was pointed out to me is that it's fairly thick and stiff, which can kind of get in the way of moving this thing around a baseboard. It can be a little annoying. Another is it takes a little bit of work to accurately attach this cable to the circuit board inside and to get all the connections right. And this connector, takes a little bit of effort to make sure you got it secured properly into the device. So one suggestion was to flip over to using something like the cable a mouse would use, which is actually a lot thinner than this. The problem with that is nobody makes these PS2 mice anymore. So actually getting the kind of cable that would have all the necessary pins but be thinner wasn't so easy. So it occurred to me after doing some digging, there's actually a great solution to this problem. And that solution is to just go all in on USB. So when I designed this, I put way too much engineering effort into making the protocol over this cable robust and well working for essentially taking a sensor that spoke I2C, which is a very common serial protocol, plus the button and all the interrupt lines, and getting them over to the device. Well, if I want more flexibility, USB, which is now what I use on the new meter probe, has a number of advantages. So, first of all, and probably the biggest sort of mechanical advantage, is the cables. What I'm actually using is a mouse cable. So this cable here is mass-produced in ridiculous quantities and very affordable, and it has a USB connector on one side and a plug on the other side and a strain relief built in, so I can just take the entire assembly and just plug it into the circuit board and I'm ready to go, and it costs next to nothing. So the mechanical side with the cable is much easier with USB. The cable's also a lot more flexible, and I think the discovery that really unlocked this was finding out that there are a number of bridge chips that will speak USB on one side and I2C and a few other accessory pins on the other side, so I could actually build this entire device without needing a microcontroller inside. And one of my biggest sort of requirements for this meter probe is I don't want this thing to have any firmware that users ever need to update. I want any issues with this to be addressed entirely on the base unit. So this is a dumb device. The only thing this needs to have is the light sensor, the button, and some memory to store calibration data. So I decided to go all in on USB. And in fact, if you look at the current prototype, you'll notice that that mini DIMM port is gone, and there's now 2 USB ports. So how'd that happen? Well, I had to integrate a small little USB hub chip in here and put on a second USB port. And when I got this one done, I took some product photos of it, which I've posted online. Meanwhile, another problem that came up in testing, which also led me down a rabbit hole, is something called electrical fast transient burst. So when I was doing some initial testing, one thing I frequently do is I simulate a photographic enlarger using this. This is just a halogen desk lamp with a wall brick that has a transformer in it. And I noticed every time I would turn this on or off, the USB devices would reset. That's bad. So I found out USB is actually very sensitive to the stuff that, say, turning a transformer on and off would do on a power line. This led me down another rabbit hole where I had to add extra power filtering to the device. And in the process of this, and again talking with someone on forums, I actually found a much more rigorous test. So apparently there are some old enlargers that have a motorized mechanism for raising them up and down that are known for causing a lot of electrical noise. One way of simulating this that I came across was this. It's a sewing machine motor with similar specs to the motor that enlarger would use. So what I could do is plug this into the same power cord as the timer unit, turn it on and off, and I could see this was actually more likely to cause problems than the lamp. So again, additional filtering, additional tweaks to the design, and I think at this point I'm robust against this as well. But just to be safe, I decided to pick up the necessary gear for doing a proper test of these sort of electrical transients, which is far harder than these real-world scenarios. So at this point, I'm basically taking sort of a two-path approach to this problem. I'm making sure the hardware is robust against real-world issues as it can be, and I'm also making sure that the software can recover when these problems happen. Because fortunately, these problems are recoverable. And yes, if you really try to test it rigorously, even a normal PC is going to run into these issues, so it's not that unusual. Finally, one idea that I've been kicking around for a while is to build a paper profile for the enlarging timer. One thing you really need to have is a reflection densitometer. And even though I sell those, they're a little expensive as a required accessory. So I decided to prototype an idea that I've been kicking around that I call the Printalizer Densa Stick. What is the Printalizer Densa Stick? Well, I basically took the hardware that's in the meter probe and some other things I've been working on for a follow-on densitometer project, and decided to see how simple and cheap of a densitometer I could make. This unit is very simple. It has no real logic on board. It's controlled entirely from the main Printalizer enlarging timer, or potentially desktop software running on a PC. It has a button. It has a light source for doing reflection measurements. It has a sensor, and it even has a focusing lens inside. This is designed to take reflection-only measurements of a contact exposure from a small step wedge. So you need to be able to measure small little patches on a sheet of paper, but I've done some testing and this actually works fairly well. So what is the plan for this? Well, I'm not yet sure if this will be sold as an independent product because it's not really usable by itself. Right now, I'm thinking of making this either an included or optional accessory for the Printalizer enlarging timer. Optional because if you actually already own a densitometer, there's really no reason to use this. But if you don't, this is a great option. So the most likely scenario is this will be an optional accessory, but a very affordable one, but those details remain to be seen. However, it does work, it is designed, and there's not that much more tweaking that's necessary to make this good to go, just a bit of software work in the firmware of the timer to support it. Finally, one thing that I've been meaning to include with the timer for a long time is a test strip jig. I currently have a 3D printed version of this that works quite well that I use myself, but I really need something I can mass produce. This is a laser cut design. It's still a work in progress. I'm not entirely sure if this is what I'm planning to ship, but the idea is you have these sliders. There are magnets in it. You stick it on the baseboard, and then you basically close these sliders as you're making your test strip. And I like this because I can't do consistent test strip patches myself very well, and this kind of solves the problem. And it also gives you that nice odd number of patches that are very useful for an f-stop style timer. Finally, before we wrap this up, there's one last project that I need to talk about, and that is the Printalizer VIS Densitometer. This project I've mentioned briefly on social media, and it is intended to be a follow-on to the densitometer that I'm currently shipping. It's not going to replace it at first. At first, it's probably going to be a separate product, and it's probably going to be more expensive. But over time, it may become the new prime product. Now, what does this thing do that's different? Well, the most basic level is it adds the ability to measure UV density of film, which is a very useful feature for people working with alternative processes. But it also has a number of other improvements on top of the current densitometer design. It has a higher quality diffuser for transmission. It's actually using flashed opal instead of acrylic. It has a focusing lens to be able to take more accurate spot measurements. It has a LED color temperature that's closer to 300K, and it has a newer sensor. Some have asked if it would be possible to upgrade the current unit to the new one. And unfortunately, even though it looks very similar on the outside, it's actually very different on the inside, so that's not going to be possible. So this is really just going to wind up being a separate product. But this product has also been in the state of almost done for quite some time. In fact, there's really only two things that have to be done before this is probably going to be ready to go into pre-production. First, I need to make some changes to how the opal diffuser is secured, because it's a piece of glass that's not that thick, and there's a rubber piece around it that's thicker than it needs to be. So I'm going to have to tweak some of the dimensions down here to make this a little more robust and assemblable. And also, there are just a couple of little dimensions inside the sensor head that need to be nitpicked. But this project has been perpetually very close for a while. I've just been putting most of my energy on the enlarging timer. So my plan for the fall is to finally get this into a state where I can go through EMC testing and get it ready for pre-production, and to hopefully do the same with the enlarging timer. Now, the enlarging timer still has more work to go, and I know everyone's wondering when it's going to be ready, but it still is unfortunately a little longer term. My goal with that project is to get it through testing and into the hands of a select group of beta users as soon as I can, even though that might not be until the end of the year, because there's a lot to iron out with the firmware and the documentation and everything else, because it's a more complex product. Once it's been stewing out there for a while and all the kinks have been worked out, then we'll look into actually going into production. Now, this video has gone on for quite a while, but I'm going to wrap it up here, and I have no doubt that I've probably forgotten something along the way, but I think I owe you all an update. So that's it for now, and have a good night.